Why are the Irish and Scots genetically different when they share so much history, language, and culture? The answer, hidden in their DNA, reveals ancient secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew about Celtic origins. In 2012, geneticists at Trinity College Dublin made a discovery that contradicted centuries of historical assumptions. While analyzing DNA from across Ireland and Scotland, they expected to find genetic uniformity among these Celtic cousins. Instead, they found significant differences that pointed to distinct ancestral origins. The Irish and Scots, despite their cultural similarities and geographic proximity, carried genetic signatures suggesting they descended from different ancient populations. How could two peoples who spoke related languages, shared similar customs, and lived just 60 miles apart across the Irish Sea be genetically distinct? The mystery deepened when researchers realized that some Irish populations were genetically closer to Spaniards than to Scots, while certain Scottish groups showed stronger links to Scandinavians. The story written in Celtic DNA wasn't about a single people splitting into two branches. It was about multiple ancient migrations creating populations that only later developed shared cultural identities. To understand Irish genetic distinctiveness, we must go back 9,000 years to the end of the Ice Age. The first humans to reach Ireland arrived around 7000 BC, crossing from Britain when sea levels were lower. But genetic analysis reveals something unexpected about these pioneers. Studies published in 2015 by geneticist Dan Bradley show that Ireland's earliest inhabitants carried genetic markers distinct from contemporary British populations. These Mesolithic Irish had ancestry linking them to populations from the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain, and Portugal. This Iberian connection appears repeatedly in Irish DNA, suggesting that some of Ireland's first settlers may have traveled up the Atlantic coast from southern Europe, rather than simply crossing from Britain. This southern route would explain why ancient Irish populations showed genetic differences from their British neighbors from the very beginning. Around 4000 BC, Neolithic farmers arrived in Ireland, bringing agriculture and monument building. These farmers, who constructed Newgrange, had ancestry from Anatolia in modern Turkey. But here's where Irish history diverges from Scottish. Genetic analysis shows the Neolithic farmers who settled Ireland had taken a different migration route than those who settled Scotland. The Irish Neolithic farmers showed stronger genetic connections to Iberian populations, while Scottish Neolithic farmers had closer ties to populations from northern France. Around 2000 BC, a dramatic genetic shift occurred in Ireland. The arrival of the Bell Beaker people brought Bronze Age technology and Indo-European languages. DNA analysis shows this migration replaced much of the existing Neolithic population. But the replacement in Ireland followed a different pattern than in Scotland. Research by Harvard geneticist David Reich revealed that the Bronze Age population replacement in Ireland was less complete than in Britain. Irish populations retained more Neolithic farmer ancestry, about 30 to 35%, compared to Scottish populations at 20 to 25%. This means the Irish maintained stronger genetic continuity with their Neolithic ancestors than the Scots did. The term Celtic creates enormous confusion in understanding Irish-Scottish genetic differences. Most people assume the Irish and Scots share common ancestry because they're both Celtic peoples. But genetics tells a more complex story. The Celtic identity was primarily cultural and linguistic, not genetic. People became Celtic by adopting Celtic languages and customs, not through shared descent from a single ancestral population. Archaeological evidence shows Celtic culture spread across Western Europe during the Iron Age, from around 800 BC onwards. But this cultural spread didn't involve massive population movements. Instead, existing populations adopted Celtic languages and customs through trade and intermarriage. The Irish and Scots both became Celtic, but they did so as genetically distinct populations. Modern DNA analysis confirms this. Dr. Brian McAvoy's research at Trinity College Dublin found that Irish and Scottish populations cluster separately in genetic analyses, despite their shared Celtic heritage. The Irish show distinctive genetic markers at frequencies that differ significantly from Scottish populations. These differences predate the Celtic period, proving that Irish-Scottish genetic distinctiveness existed long before either population became culturally Celtic. Here's a crucial difference that shaped Irish and Scottish genetics divergently. Roman conquest. Britain, including what would become Scotland, was conquered by Rome in 43 AD. For nearly 400 years, southern and central Britain was part of the Roman Empire. Roman soldiers from across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East were stationed in Britain. They married local women and left genetic traces. Ireland was never conquered by Rome. The Romans called it Hibernia and considered it beyond the empire's reach. This meant Ireland never experienced the genetic mixing that Roman occupation brought to Britain. While Scottish populations, particularly in the lowlands, acquired Roman period ancestry from Mediterranean and Middle Eastern sources, Ireland remained genetically isolated from these influences. Genetic studies detect Roman-era ancestry in Scottish populations, including Y chromosome haplogroups like J2 and EM78, common in Mediterranean regions. These markers appear at much lower frequencies in Ireland, sometimes absent entirely. This Roman period genetic input created a lasting difference between Irish and Scottish populations. In the 5th century AD, Irish people called the Scoti began migrating to western Scotland, establishing the kingdom of Dál Riata. These Irish settlers brought Gaelic language and culture to Scotland, eventually giving the country its name. Scotland literally means land of the Irish. This Gaelic migration created genetic connections between the two populations, but in a geographically specific pattern. Western Scotland, particularly Argyll and the Hebrides, shows strong Irish genetic influence. DNA studies reveal that populations in these regions cluster with Irish populations in genetic analyses. However, eastern and southern Scotland show little Irish genetic influence. The lowlands retain their Brittonic, Celtic, and later Anglo-Saxon and Norse ancestry. Dr. James Wilson's research at the University of Edinburgh found that people from the western Scottish islands share up to 40% of their ancestry with Irish populations, while eastern Scottish lowlanders share less than 10%. The Viking Age, beginning in the late 8th century, affected Ireland and Scotland differently. In Ireland, Vikings established coastal settlements like Dublin, but genetic analysis shows their demographic impact was limited. Viking ancestry in Ireland averages only 5 to 10%, concentrated in eastern coastal regions. Scotland experienced heavier Viking settlement, particularly in Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides. These regions became Norse-dominated for centuries. Modern genetic studies show that Orkney and Shetland populations carry 40 to 50% Norwegian ancestry. Even mainland Scotland shows higher average Scandinavian ancestry, 12 to 18%, than Ireland. This differential Viking impact reinforced Irish-Scottish genetic distinctiveness. The Norse contribution shifted Scotland's overall genetic profile, while Ireland's composition remained more stable. The Plantation of Ulster in the 17th century created one of the most significant genetic divides within Ireland. Beginning in 1609, the English crown granted Ulster land to Scottish and English settlers. Tens of thousands of lowland Scots migrated to Northern Ireland. This Scottish settlement created a genetic anomaly: populations in Northern Ireland that are genetically Scottish rather than Irish. Modern DNA analysis shows that Protestant populations in Northern Ireland cluster with Scottish populations rather than with Catholic Irish populations. The partition of Ireland in 1921 reflected not just religious divisions, but also this underlying genetic reality. Specific genetic markers distinguish Irish from Scottish populations in measurable ways. Y chromosome analysis reveals distinct patterns. The Irish show particularly high frequencies of haplogroup R1b-M222, associated with the legendary Nile of the Nine Hostages. This marker appears in approximately 20% of Irish men, but less than 5% of Scottish men. Conversely, Scottish populations show higher frequencies of haplogroup I1, associated with Scandinavian ancestry. Mitochondrial DNA also shows distinctive patterns. Irish populations have elevated frequencies of certain H and U5 subclades, while Scottish populations show different distributions with higher frequencies of haplogroups associated with Scandinavian ancestry. One of the most surprising findings in Irish genetics is the persistent Iberian Connection. Multiple studies have found that Irish populations, particularly in Western Ireland, show genetic affinity with populations from northern Spain and Portugal. This appears in both Y chromosome data and autosomal DNA analyses. Several theories explain this Iberian link. Ancient Neolithic migrations, Bronze Age maritime trade networks, or even Iron Age Celtic migrations from Iberia to Ireland. Whatever the cause, the Iberian genetic signature in Ireland is real and measurable, particularly strong in counties Kerry, Cork, and Galway. Scottish populations show much weaker Iberian connections. Genetic differences between Irish and Scottish populations have real health implications. Hemochromatosis, an iron overload disorder, appears at particularly high rates in Ireland. The C282Y mutation reaches frequencies of 10 to 14% in Irish populations, one of the highest rates worldwide. Scottish populations show lower frequencies, typically 5 to 8%. Conversely, certain genetic variants associated with Scandinavian ancestry appear more frequently in Scottish populations. The factor V Leiden mutation shows higher frequencies in Scotland than Ireland, likely reflecting greater Norse genetic input. The Irish and Scots are genetically different because they descend from distinct combinations of ancestral populations that arrived via different routes and mixed in different proportions. Ireland's genetic profile reflects stronger Neolithic farmer ancestry, Iberian connections, and relative isolation from Roman and heavy Viking influence. Scotland's profile shows more Brittonic, Anglo-Saxon, and Norse ancestry, with Roman-era Mediterranean input and heavier Viking settlement. These differences emerged from geography, timing, and historical circumstance. Ireland's position at Europe's western edge made it a terminus for Atlantic migrations, but isolated it from continental influences. Scotland's position connected it to both maritime and overland migration routes, exposing it to more diverse genetic inputs. The shared Celtic culture that makes Irish and Scots seem so similar was adopted by already distinct populations. Language, customs, and identity can spread without massive genetic mixing. Two populations can become culturally Celtic while remaining genetically distinct, which is exactly what happened. Understanding these genetic differences enriches rather than diminishes Irish and Scottish identities. It shows that identity is cultural and chosen, not genetically determined.